interoception is now defined quite broadly as the sense of the internal states of the body. The peripersonal space, one of the definitions, is the ability to predict the interaction with the body from the outside. And the interpersonal space is largely a psychological concept of a distance of comfortable social interactions. Automatic and unintentional reactions, which lie within the body of interoception, can be monitored, perceived, and used to modify intentional behaviors and exteroception. And this is what we are going to talk about today. Quite recently, interoception gains popularity and is propagating to different various domains of neuroscience. In my opinion, it starts from the ancient James Long theory of emotions, which postulates that bodily sensations provide the critical basis of emotional experience. And a more recent rebirth of this direction, thanks to Antonio Damasio, is the somatic marker hypothesis, which basically states that decisions and behaviors are guided by physiological patterns of interoceptive and emotional information. In other words, we effectively use the modifications of our internal states to create our emotions, intentions, and behaviors. And even a more recent development of this direction is the embodied predictive interoception coding model, which is based on the general framework of predictive coding theory. It is thought that active inference in making predictions about situations is based on previous experience. And these predictions, when they coupled with incoming sensory signals, allow us to compute a prediction error. And this prediction error, which is the discrepancy within the body in case of interoception or from outside of the body, if we speak about exteroception, allow us to minimize those discrepancies by building modifications of those predictions or modifying, adapting our body position, location, or finally altering the method, the approach for computing and interpretation of the incoming stimulation. The cerebral network related to this interoceptive predictive coding is insula, anterior cingulate, and ventral prefrontal cortex, which is quite different from the peripersonal space network, the network which plays an important role in what can be called predictive coding of the exteroceptive world, the PPS, or the bodily ownership, which is largely a frontal-parietal network, premotor cortex and different parietal areas. Now in blocks, we will examine about 10 papers I was able rapidly to collect, mostly recent ones, which build links between external and internal world. And first link is whether proximity can affect our autonomic activity. And in fact, yes. This experiment demonstrates that that electrodermal activity, which is an index of arousal, activation, threat, maybe, is maximal when the needle touch is at the site of the hand, and minimal when it is as far as 40 centimeters, which is logical. The greater is the expectation, the more is the need for the modification of the internal state. While after training with the stick, this pattern is altered. And specifically, it's interesting that the electrodermal activity during the representation of the thread, the needle, in a distant location is augmented in comparison to pre-training state, which is a beautiful illustration of how the modifications of the peripersonal space can modify our responses, our autonomic responses and internal state responses to the external world stimuli. This is about interpersonal space, which is, to remind you, the social facet of the peripersonal space. And autonomic reactions. We still speak about electrodermal activity. When the subjects are approached with the illusion of the moving individual, of different, bright, positive or negative, neutral expressions, you can see that the interpersonal distance is sensitive to the emotional expression, and it is larger for the aggressive emotional phases, which is logical. We don't want to interact with aggressive people. And what is interesting is that when this angry phase illusion enters our peripersonal state, a peripersonal space, the angry stimuli, they provoke the greatest augmentation of the phasic electrodermal activity. And this response, here they collapse angry and neutral, maybe to gain more power for the study. This response is correlated to the minimum comfort distance, which illustrates how our representation of the external world can be shaped by the degree of the arousal or discomfort which is brought to us by the adverse stimuli. This study is from an entirely semantic imaginary world. The authors used Chinese hieroglyphs, which tell nothing to me. I don't speak Chinese, but which are quite transparent for native speakers. And this little symbol was of two different options, whether it was the pinch grip classifier or a big object classifier. And they were congruent or incongruent with the objects which are written here. I have no idea what is this object, but Chinese people can read it. And unlike those who don't speak Chinese, there was a beautiful effect in the pupillary reaction to this text line. First, the incongruent response was always less. If it is a senseless expression, then we don't feel involvement, and this doesn't modify our state. Both for the big and for the small, for the pinch grip classifier. But what is even more interesting is that overall pupillary dilation was greater for pinch grip classifier, which can illustrate a simulation, a mental simulation of the PPS or the preparation for action. Just because they read something that makes sense from the point of view of what has to be done with the object. A bit of our own results from the perception of emotional expressions. At the far distance, small faces, and at the short distance, large faces. We demonstrated, as it has been shown many times, that there is a consistent difference between the pupillary diameter for the aggressive and non-aggressive stimuli. The aggressive, they pose threats, and the pupil dilates a bit more. But what is interesting here, and what we have demonstrated effectively, is that the proximal condition, when the face is large, discriminates much better between the two emotions at the level of the unintentional automatic autonomic response. With interoceptive sensitivity to one's heartbeat predicts participants' autonomic response at a different social distances. The experiment was built as the socially relevant or non-relevant STIC stimulus, the real world, was placed close, far, or at the level of the touch towards the hand of the subject. And in blocks, they altered those conditions. And they estimated respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which can be interpreted as a measure of parasympathetic tone or relaxation, always in comparison to the resting state baseline no stimulation. And what they have demonstrated is that in general, when something happens next to your hand, far or close, there is a negative, you see, it's always a negative change in respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which means reduction of this relaxation tone. But what is interesting is that in those subjects who had high sensitivity to the internal state, high ability to estimate the heartbeat, the social condition was largely different from the non-social condition. And within the what they call PPS, which is those two conditions, there was a greater change in respiratory sinus arrhythmia in comparison to more distant situation, just in this group, which means that, well, in the opinion of the authors, that the sensitivity to the internal state is important for shaping our reaction to the invasion into peripersonal space, and specifically for the social invasion in the peripersonal space. And to prove this, they demonstrate that the heartbeat perception score, this is the sensitivity. 1 gives absolutely high sensitivity and 0 means inability to count own heartbeats at all. This score correlates positively with the change of respiratory sinus arrhythmia in the social condition. The greater is the sensitivity, the more is the distance between the social and the non-social condition. Now, can autonomic activity modify our sense of proximity? Apparently, yes. If autonomic activity is modified by the social presence. Those were two conditions, and this is the paradigm when two subjects had to judge the midpoint of the radial line. So this is the line which was from me to the other person, this direction. And what they demonstrate is that increased electrodermal activity, well, increased due to the presence of the other person. It was correlated to a decline of this midpoint towards the subject. This is the correlation. They try to show the illustration, but I created my own illustration for my own clarity. So if electrodermal reaction to the presence of the other is the increase of electrodermal activity, as you can see from this plot, there were both positive and negative change in spontaneous fluctuations of the sympathetic tone of the skin. This can illustrate discomfort or arousal when the other subject is present within the same setting, and they try to withdraw these two midpoints toward themselves. While if the reaction is opposite, they feel more relaxed, they feel more comfortable when they do this task together with somebody else. Maybe they were friends. They decline the judgment of the midpoint in a different direction, which of course cannot be qualified as a pure measure of peripersonal space, but apparently has something to do with proximity. And here, at least it is correlated. It's hard to say what is the causation, but the correlation is there. Now, the other way around, whether interoceptive accuracy can have an effect on proximity. And apparently, yes. This is one of the classical tricks to estimate the extent of the peripersonal space, which is multisensory facilitation. Looming sound, when the sense of proximity is there, facilitates somatosensory perception and makes reaction times faster. In a number of subjects, they estimated the heartbeat accuracy, and the result was that higher interoceptive accuracy predicts narrower PPS boundary. This is the correlation they built between the central point of this response normalized reaction time curve and the level of the interoceptive accuracy, which is about the same message as on this plot. There is a correlation, and at this level of psychology, they show that this correlation is mediated by the private self-consciousness, which assesses the extent to which individuals focus on internal thoughts, sensations, and feelings. And this ability to perceive oneself apparently modifies how the peripersonal space is perceived or at least operated. Body ownership is a bit on the side of the peripersonal space, but I thought that those few studies can be interesting and relevant for the topic of the discussion. Whether the body ownership manipulations, known rubber hand illusion, can affect interoceptive accuracy. And apparently yes, at least in a subpopulation of people with low interoceptive accuracy. This is a control situation when the rubber hand was just shown without any stimulation at all. And here it is an intermittent block design when the rubber hand and the own hand has been stimulated, and then the heartbeats were counted in order to estimate interoceptive accuracy. They used two stimulation conditions: the synchronous stimulation, which produced a powerful rubber hand illusion. Like, people felt that this rubber hand is their own hand, while asynchronous was not that effective at all. And this is what is compared here. And the change from the baseline of the interoceptive accuracy, first it was positive, there was an increase. And this increase was better in case of synchronous stimulation, which produced the illusion. On the other hand, can interoceptive accuracy do something to body ownership perception? And this is the last paper for today. Apparently, if people have pre-existing high interoceptive sensitivity, then this interesting manipulation can change our sense of similarity, or better to say dissimilarity, with the facial appearance of the other individual. What they did is so-called cardiovascular procedure. They changed the tone of the face of the other person, either in a synchronous manner with the own heartbeat recorded online, monitored online, or in an asynchronous random way. And the greater was the interoceptive sensitivity, which has been estimated before in a different session, the greater was the tendency to judge a morphed face, a mixture of own photo and the photo of this other person, towards the similarity with the person who has been used in this procedure. However, if the initial interoceptive sensitivity was low, this manipulation didn't improve our sense of similarity, ourselves and the other person. Briefly, my conclusions are as follows. Proximity affects autonomic reaction. Arousal comes up when we feel that something is approaching us or that we have better chances, we predict interactions with something from the outside. We get prepared. The internal state, on the other side, also modifies the sense of proximity, which appears to be more complex and non-linear story. And finally, the interoceptive awareness is an important mediator of those interactions. In case we are well aware of what happens inside of us, this will affect how we respond to the external world. And apparently this can make our adaptive behavior more useful to optimize our internal state. While in case of low interoceptive sensitivity, which is the case for many different and diverse neurological conditions like depression, anxiety, autism, etc., then those two worlds, internal world and external world, they are largely isolated. And this may contribute to the behavioral and emotional regulatory issues in such individuals. Thank you. That's all.